whistleblowing are fundamental to democratic societies if we are to effectively hold our governments to account. The hallmark of a democracy is having mechanisms by which abuses of power can be exposed and human rights and civil liberties can be restored and protected. Hacking, leaking and whistleblowing have all played an indispensable role in the last 15 years in exposing really significant abuses of power by the US and the UK, both in their foreign policies and in their mass surveillance of the civilian population. What I'm going to talk about is not terribly cheerful. I will try and spare you all of the grim details, but what I want to talk about is the most extreme abuse of power that we've seen in that last 15 years. And that is a program that was run by the CIA in collaboration with 45 other countries for the kidnap, secret detention, interrogation and torture of so-called high-value terror suspects. The UK was particularly complicit in the CIA's rendition program. It operated from 2001 until around 2009, and a total of 119 prisoners were held in a network of secret prisons run by or on behalf of the CIA across the globe. They were subjected to some of the most horrendous torture, and you may have heard about some of this: the waterboarding, the prolonged abuse, sexual abuse, rectal force feeding, and so on. Most of those who were held, we now know, had no connection whatsoever to Al-Qaeda or to any other terrorist organisation. Many of them had in fact been sold for bounties by corrupt Pakistani military and police forces in the Afghan-Pakistan border areas in 2002-2003. Over the last 6 years, I've been researching this programme to try and map its contours and to show which prisons operated when, where the prisoners went, and what kind of torture they were subjected to. In doing that, there were two really important sources of data to me. The first were leaks, hacks, and whistleblowing, and the second was big data. And this was actually data that wasn't leaked, but that was obtained mostly through legitimate means. I'll start with the leaks and whistleblowing, and this is tangentially linked to hacking, but is important. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, there was a man called John Kiriakou, who was a CIA counter-terrorism operations officer, who was present in Pakistan when a man called Abu Zubaydah was detained by US forces and handed on to the CIA. If you've seen the film Zero Dark 30, Abu Zubaydah is the subject of that film. The film makes the fallacious claim that the repeated waterboarding and other torture of Zubaydah produced actionable intelligence that eventually led the US to find bin Laden. This is false. When the CIA began using its so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, torture to you and me, against Zubaydah, John Kiriakou refused to participate. And what he tried to do was feed up the, what he saw as the abuse of power by CIA operatives up the CIA hierarchy. He was silenced. In 2007, he appeared on ABC News and provided full details confirming the extent of CIA torture. He was then pursued by the US government, prosecuted and imprisoned for 30 months in a plea deal in which he sought to avoid a 45-year imprisonment for espionage. I've known John for a little while, and I was speaking to him last week about this event. And one of the questions I asked him was it worth it? Would you do it all again? He was emphatic. Torture is illegal, it is immoral, it corrupts, and it corrodes us. So whistleblowing, leaking and hacking did play a role in my work to uncover the evolution of the CIA's rendition program. I did draw on material from WikiLeaks. There were leaks from the CIA or from people in the US government who sought to expose torture. One of the most interesting leaks came from the International Committee of the Red Cross. The Red Cross never exposes details of the discussions it has with governments about human rights violations. And in the case of this program, it made an exception. But another source of significant data for me in mapping the CIA's rendition program was some really boring air traffic control data. This is really nerdy, and I have to say I now have huge respect for plane spotters that I never had before. Why did this happen? Well, to carry out its secret kidnaps and its transfer of prisoners around the world, the CIA contracted a number of private executive jets to carry the prisoners. These are fairly small, beautiful aircraft, which if you have a spare few thousands of dollars, you can hire yourself. And they used these planes to fly prisoners around the world over that 7-year period. And what happened was that plane spotters, who are of course all connected by technology these days, started spotting these weird planes turning up in certain locations quite regularly. They shared information and they started to see patterns in the journeys that these aircraft were taking. And one of the most interesting parts of that was that these aircraft were landing in Afghanistan, where of course the US was involved in its occupation and war, and also Guantanamo Bay, where the US was operating a prison to detain terror suspects. What we did was we obtained air traffic control data relating to dozens of these planes over that 10-year period. Most of the data that we got is uninteresting because lots of the flights these aircraft flew were completely legitimate, normal corporate business activity. So we had 11,000 rows of really boring data, and we had to try and find in that data the interesting stories. Each line in the data is a journey of an aircraft from location A to location B, so in and of itself tells us nothing. If you organise this data by aircraft tail number and date, you start to see patterns in the journeys these aircraft take and fly. So to give you an example, a typical rendition operation would involve the aircraft flying from an airfield somewhere in the US to Langley, which is where the CIA is headquartered, and just outside Washington, DC. It would then fly to Western Europe where it would refuel. It would fly on to locations in the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, sometimes Eastern Europe, where it would pick up prisoners. Some of those would be flown on to Afghanistan, where they'd be dropped off and imprisoned. The aeroplane would then fly back through European airspace, refuel again, possibly go on to Guantanamo Bay, and then go back to the US. And this would typically be over a 10-day period. So when we had all this data going over the whole years of the programme, we were able to show which of these operations were rendition operations. Triangulated with testimony we had from victims, with human rights investigative work, and with declassified documents, we were able to attach particular prisoners to particular flights. In other words, we could prove that they had been kidnapped. We also used lots of documentary analysis to map where they went, because lots of them were moved several times through these prisons, as each of those prisons was exposed, through the work of investigative journalists mainly. So the work my team has done has been used in litigation on behalf of some of the victims of this programme in the European Court of Human Rights, in some of the detainee trials in Guantanamo Bay, and it also led to an investigation by Police Scotland into the use of Scottish airports for these rendition operations. So in my mind, leakers, hackers and whistleblowers have made very, very brave and principled decisions on matters of huge importance to us. When combined with what you can do with big data, you can start to tell very important stories about the truths of the abuse of power. Torture is illegal, it does corrode us and it does corrupt us, and it destroys our societies. It's not just human rights activists or academics who've studied this that say this. In 2014, a cross-party US Senate Intelligence Committee carried out an investigation into CIA torture. At the end of 2014, it published its 500-page executive summary, fairly heavily redacted, of its 6,000-page investigation into CIA torture. And that executive summary corroborated many of our findings from mapping the flight data. Importantly, though, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence also confirmed that the torture had served no useful purpose, including the torture of Abu Zubaydah, that most prisoners involved had no connection to terrorism, and even worse, that the CIA's use of torture had a significant blowback effect for US foreign policy. Hackers, leakers and whistleblowers that expose the corrupt and excessive use of power by our governments are guardians of our humanity and our freedoms. They should be celebrated. Thank you.